Hey everybody, welcome to Coffee with Ryan. I am on a little bit earlier today. My schedule demands me to do so. And finally, I feel like I get a chance to hang out with everyone. So I hope some people are able to join. I'm gonna pull up the chat here. Wow, it's been a couple weeks since I streamed. Crazy. Feels kind of weird. How's everyone doing? Let me pull up the chat. Feels very weird. When I was streaming what's up everybody, I see some people are joining. When I was streaming all the time, you just get so used to it because there was, over the summer there was a long period of time where I was just streaming like 3 times a week, and you get so used to it. A lot of people ask, have asked Mercury or have wondered about with me, how do you do the live streams? Don't you feel nervous? It's kind of like jumping in cold water. Once you're in, you're in. You're good. You might have your heart rate might go up for a minute, but once you're really in, you're in. What's going on? I see Hazabin. Sorry, let me see if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Hazabajan. How you doing? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Today we're just gonna hang out. I do have a couple topics in mind if we decide to go that route about the archetypes in the brain and how those things intersect. But I also just want to have an open conversation. If there's any questions or any topics that any of you want to bring to the forefront, I would be happy to address those. Diamond Roses, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. So yeah, anything that y'all want to talk about. Hazabajan says, that's right, I pronounced your name correctly. That's fantastic. I think I'm going to pull up the chat on my computer because honestly, looking at the phone is kind of a pain here. So let's do that. Boom. YouTube. And sorting myself out is live. Glad you're here. Pause it. Now I've got the chat up on my computer. So, magician archetype. Oh, that's a great topic. I've got a book that addresses the magician archetype. I'll actually grab it real quick. It's just right over here on the table, so just give me 1 second. Okay, here it is. This person was a lifelong student of Carl Jung's and studied with him directly. Sally Nichols. This book came out I think it came out this year or last year. It came out, Sally Nichols, 2019, so it came out this year. The whole chapter on the magician archetype. So let's start with that. That's a great topic. So I'm going to read a little bit to you. I can't read too much, otherwise I could get into some copyright issues. But we could read a little bit just to get our juices flowing here. Let's see. The magician holds. Good morning, Dick Justice. We're going to read about the archetype of the magician per the suggestion of name 9426. The magician's gift for miracle and deception is manifold. By directing our attention away from the golden coin, he can ensnare and befuddle us with his sleight of hand. Like human consciousness itself, an aspect of which he symbolizes, the magician can create Maya. In Hinduism, Maya means the world of illusion. And in Hindu, just to give you some context, in Hinduism, Maya is the manifest world. So there's Purusha, which is like the all-encompassing reality that is behind everything. And then there's Prakriti, which creates Maya, illusion. So in Hinduism, everything's illusion. That's where that word comes from. Okay, aside from that, let's keep going here. Like human consciousness itself, an aspect which he symbolizes, the magician can create Maya, the magic illusion of 10,000 things. For by making the objects on his table disappear, he can dramatize the simple truth that every object, Everything is but an appearance of reality. It is we who create the world which appears to exist. By transforming one object or element into another, which is also alchemy, by the way, the magician reveals for another truth, namely that underneath the 10,000 things, all manifestations are one. All elements are one, and all energies are one. Air is fire, is earth, is rabbits, is pigeons, is water, is wine, is one. All are whole and all are holy. The magician helps us to understand that the physical universe is not the result of the original life power acting on matter, rather it is the result of life power acting upon itself, out of itself. The one power builds all shapes and forms, all force and myriads of structures. Let me see if I should keep reading here. I'll read another couple paragraphs. Originally, only the gods or their earthly representatives, the priests, were felt to have this magic power. One such figure was Hermes I don't know how to pronounce Hermes' last name, Trismegistus, a mythical figure variously associated with the Egyptian god Thoth and Greek god Hermes. It was he who left us this succinct summary of the topic now under discussion. All things are from this one. By the meditation of the one, and all things have their birth from the one thing. As already indicated, this expresses a truth on both the macrocosmic and microcosmic planes of existence. Magic is sometimes called the science of hidden relationships, be it miracle or trick. One underlying essence of this art is revelation. The magician has the power to reveal the fundamental reality, the isness that underlies all. He represents a wonder-working aspect of ourselves which can divine the hidden wellspring of life and open them up for creative use. This kind of revelation is beautifully symbolized in the story of Moses, who, divining up the waters, smote the hidden waters, smote the rock with his miraculous staff until its springs gushed forth to slake the thirst of his people. Quote, blessed are they that hunger and thirst, unquote. In the service of vital human need, miracles can occur. One might say that miracles can only happen in response to a need transcending the ego. Interesting. It's fascinating stuff. It's a great little book on the different tarot card symbols, and I think it deals with a handful of different archetypes. I used some of it in my recent research paper for grad school. I wrote a paper on the archetypes of ancient Greece and the human brain, and I took a look at figures like Hermes and figures like Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena, and I looked at, okay, so if we were going to map these archetypes onto the anatomy of the brain, where would they go? What would they represent? Hazabajan says, it might be a stupid question, but what is an archetype? It's not a stupid question. That's a great question. Because even Carl Jung, the man himself who popularized the term archetype, was very inconsistent in what he meant and how he defined it. I mean, if you read Jung, you'll see that he goes back and forth. He says the archetypes are this, no archetypes are that. So, what he attempts to do through explaining it in many different ways is show that archetypes have a nebulous nature, and they shift and transform, and they're not fixed, stagnant states of being. There's archetypes as such, and then there's archetypal images. An archetype as such is something we can't see. We can't actually see the archetype. It's an underlying energetic substructure or neurological substructure that we represent through communicatory images, because the images allow us to see the underlying, to start to unveil the underlying patterns of existence. So an archetypal image is a representation of a deeper, you call it truth, pattern, way of being that is repeated across eons and eons of time. And what qualifies an archetype is that there's a universal aspect to it, meaning that if you look at history, you see it continue to emerge. So there's something fundamental about the archetype, whether it's in human nature or in the universe, that recapitulates it over and over again. So I hope that makes sense. So it's essentially a symbol for an aspect of reality. So it can be so many things. The warrior is an archetype. It's an aspect of reality. A warrior-like personification. Or, for example, a mother is an archetype. The sun is an archetype. The moon is an archetype. Everything that you can repeat across multiple iterations of time and space can be said to have an archetypal aspect. Genetics are archetypal. The genes that we phylogenetically pass down through, all of human ancestry, and then those genes split off and they create individualized components that are novel within certain family lineages or even within the ontogenetic individual. And so it's the idea, at least where I'm taking the idea of archetypes, is there's the old historical cross-cultural images, and then there's the novel individual who expresses those images through their unique personality. So every personality has an archetypal aspect to it because it's a shared universal acting out of a belief or a system of behavior that is uniquely distributed through your own biology, personality, soul, whatever you want to call it. Named 9426, and I should say before I read this, hope that makes sense. I'm absolutely fried. These research papers took everything out of my functional prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for critical thinking, and it's been nonstop. And I'm so glad to be able to be on this stream with you. I've really missed live streaming and talking to everyone, so thank you so much for being here. But 9426 says, magician is like the Gandalf character, question mark. Yeah, I think the magician is similar to the I think there's definitely a bit of a difference between the magician and the wizard as archetypes, but there's a lot of similarities too. I think one of the fundamental differences is a magician is a trickster and is employing sleight of hand and perhaps using some real aspects of magic, but also is really well versed in the art of deception. That's why Hermes is known as the trickster, right? He could be very deceiving and create illusions, right? Magicians create illusions. Whereas if I think of Gandalf, there's a purity and a direct line to the creator that's instantiated in his character that is more along the lines of something like enlightenment or the wise old man archetype or the true self. Gandalf is a symbol of the self in Jungian terms, which is the wholeness. Gandalf is a symbol of wholeness, and Gandalf works with Frodo. He opens the door to the soul. That's what the wise old man archetype does. He opens the door to the soul. So if you look at a Merlin or a Gandalf, there's something more pure about it, is the word I would use. Hazabajan says, yeah, that did. I'm assuming I answered your questions. I'll have to look into it. Yeah. Do look into it. It's a fascinating subject. So, yeah, Tolkien talk. Actually, so I'll tell you what I wrote. What's up, Boy Meets World? I have missed you, man. It's, it's been a while. Thanks for being here. Let's talk about what I wrote about my research papers. I've had several requests. They want to know, what are you learning in grad school? So we'll start with the first one. I took a look at Tolkien's Silmarillion, which is his background work for his Lord of the Rings universe. And in Tolkien's Silmarillion, uh, basically he's setting the foundation for the rest of Middle Earth stories to take place. And Tolkien, for those of you, J.R.R. Tolkien, for those of you who don't know, the creator of Lord of the Rings, he had this amazing encyclopedic creative ability. He was so generative with his creativity. He created a whole language, an elvish language. He was a philologist. He studied languages and understood the structure of languages. And from that, he created a whole language just so that he could make his imaginary universe more real. That's how much this guy was committed to fantasy. And he opened the door. If any of you are into modern fantasy stories, whether it be Game of Thrones or The Wheel of Time or Harry Potter or whatever, he opened the door for all those universes to come into their own. And so anyways, Tolkien's he is like the top tier of fantasy literature, even though it's gotten more nuanced and in a lot of ways better since Tolkien wrote. Like if you read The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, it's just amazing. Randall Thor and Matrim Cauthon and Perrin Albara. Yeah, I think. Anyways, it's amazing stories that have come from Tolkien's inspiration. But yeah, so I took a look at the Silmarillion, and there was one of the central figures of the Silmarillion was Melkor, and Melkor is basically the fallen angel. And I took a look at how the archetype of the fallen angel and Satan and all these different cross-cultural narratives that fit right into Melkor's descent into evil. So basically what happened, in spoiler alert, okay, because I mean I don't know if any of you are going to read the Silmarillion or not, but basically what happened is Iluvatar, who is the creator, God within the Silmarillion, created the Ainur. And if you're a Silmarillion nut, don't come after me because I'm not an expert on it. I just looked at a very specific aspect of it. So if I mispronounce anything, just forgive me. The Ainur were also known as the Valar. They were basically created in the image of Iluvatar as the highest angels. Okay, we'll just call it the highest deities. And one of them was Melkor, who was the most powerful angel. Sound familiar? Much like Satan, he tried to bend reality to his own will. Now the difference is Iluvatar's universe was created through musical symphonies. So Iluvatar emanated this music, and the music created things. And then the Ainur also were permitted to create music in the adornment of Iluvatar's mighty greatness, basically. So in the image of God, we get to be musical, and the music has this creative power to create frequencies and aspects of the universe under Iluvatar's perfect being. However, what happened with Melkor is he sought the void. So he found a void which was actually outside of Iluvatar and created music of his own volition and twisted the will of the creator. And so Iluvatar gets upset, and Melkor essentially descends. He gets ashamed and resentful for being rebuked, and he descends and becomes this just horribly treacherous evil figure. And it's so similar to the fall of Satan. Now the difference is in Satan's fall, in the myth of Satan's fall, Satan essentially was more of an intellectual pursuit, because Satan tried to rally some of the angels to persecute God on theological premises. So Satan's whole idea is God is theologically warped. I have a philosophical argument of why God is warped, and basically he was trying to instantiate his own lust for power, and that created the war up in heaven, and then Satan eventually descended. So I think that's really just fascinating. So I looked at Melkor, who eventually became Morgoth once he was known for all his horrible evils. Melkor is a shadow figure in the Jungian sense. He represents the repressed aspects of the psyche that we ignore, and because we ignore these aspects of ourselves and we cast them away, we create the underworld within ourselves. And so because Melkor as a aspect of creation, right? Because you have to look at this philosophically, and you have to realize in some sense that Melkor's descent into evil is kind of Iluvatar's fault, because Iluvatar just created Melkor, and here Melkor is as this being of creation thinking, I'd like to do this. I have an urge to create things of my own accord. That urge, obviously, could only have been instantiated by the creator's will, because the creator, created all things. So the only conclusion you can make is, one, there's a couple. Iluvatar wanted there to be evil in the world to create a landscape of free will for the mortal beings and the lower deities, so that they could make choices and explore the range of free will they have. Much like in Christian theology, this comes up. Or two, God himself, the creator, has a blind spot that they aren't aware of within themselves, which generates shadow content, which would essentially be this really ridiculous argument, but very also potent, an argument for the ignorance of the omnipotent God, right? That even in that statement, and I know this is really heady, so feel free to just tell me to stop if this is not interesting, but in that statement, in of itself, it's a paradox. It's a contradiction, right? The omnipotent creator has a blind spot, right? The all-knowing knows not, right? That doesn't make any sense. So then that would mean there's a fundamental, contradiction in the whole universe as such. The whole premise of creation is contradiction. And Carl Jung, in his analysis of the story of Job, he kind of came to the conclusion that might be the case, is that there's just such a fundamental contradiction in God, per se, that even God has a shadow. I think that's an interesting topic. Adela, darling, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Daniel, yes, I'm so glad I can finally bring you a video. I know you were asking for one the other day. So anyway, does that make any sense? Anyway, I wrote a whole research paper on that. I looked at all the theological parallels. I looked at Melkor from the Silmarillion as a descending figure, and then I looked at the descent as an archetypal mode of being, in which people make choices that continue to inflame their own resentful hearts. So if you look, there's a well-researched cycle called the shame rage cycle, and it's been linked to things like the school shootings, like the Columbine shooting, for example. So there's this way in which we feel shame, and there's different paths to take from that point. Some people, the shame turns into rage and resentment, which turns into violence. So it's called the shame rage cycle. And you can see that in Melkor's descent. He was ridiculed by Iluvatar, the creator, and basically said, Iluvatar said, "What are you doing? You're totally fucking this up." He felt ashamed, and it says literally in Tolkien's book, and from that shame grew a secret anger. And obviously from that anger turned into evil. So you can also see these archetypal degenerations of the human soul in stories like Cain and Abel. Jordan Peterson does a fantastic job outlining that in his book Maps of Meaning. He talks about the hostile brotherhood and basically the tension between the eternal adversary, Melkor, Satan, Set from the Egyptian creation myths, from Set and Osiris, and Thor and Loki. So there's this archetypal hostility between brothers, which means two modes of being. So don't look at it literally. Between two modes of being within the human heart, one of resentment and revenge, the other of humility and curiosity and exploration and benefit to others. So there's the benevolent hero and the resentful adversary, and Satan and Christ, obviously. So you look at all these and you see those are two primary modes of human nature. And again, someone asked about what is an archetype? Like, an archetype is a mode of being, like that. A resentful mode of being is archetypal, like Cain or Loki or Satan, etc. So anyway, so I took a look at all that, and what I found is that, and I'll get to your comments in just a second, what I found is that the descent of Melkor is represent it's a metaphysical statement about the potential descent of every human being, just like the descent of Satan. If for example, if a and this is all philosophical. I'm not making empirical theological claims. I'm just talking about the philosophical, psychological meaning of these things. This descent of Melkor and this descent of Satan is a metaphysical statement, a psychological statement about the potential for every human being's descent, for every human being to fall into resentfulness and bitterness. So it's a story about how, well, if a high being like a god, like a almost perfect being, like a high angel, can fall into resentful lust and revenge and violence, then what does that say about mortal beings? Well, that says that we've got a battle that we're all fighting inside of ourselves to live a soulful, honorable life of integrity and meaning, and that battle is the essential battle between heaven and hell as a general Christian theological overview. So that's what I looked into. I thought it was a really great project. I learned a ton. I love doing these research papers because I learned so much about literature and philosophy and religion and psychology, and it just makes my brain go. I learn a lot from writing. So anyways, thank you for letting me flesh out. There's a lot more to all of that. I just wanted to share. That was one paper. Now I'm going to read your comments. Boy Meets Wort says, my favorite thing in the whole Middle-earth mythology is the way the same themes replay themselves over and over again, from Melkor and the Valar to Gondolin and the island that sunk, can't remember the name, all the way down to the elves, men, and hobbits. Your work sounds awesome, man. Thanks, Boy Meets Wort. And you also say, very cool. Another book that really explores that well is East of Eden. Really good book, in my opinion. Whoa, I should check that out. Thank you for the recommendation. And I'm so glad to hear that you're interested in these topics as well, Boy Meets Wort. And by the way, as many of you know, Amazon is doing a Lord of the Rings series, and I think it is set before the period of time that Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring was generated. So it'll be, I think, maybe between the Silmarillion and that, or maybe during the Silmarillion. I haven't researched it that much, but I've been keeping an eye on that because I'm a big fantasy fan. On Daniel Green's YouTube channel, he covers all the fantasy news and stuff. It's pretty good. So anyways, any questions, any changes of topic, you want me to dive deeper into this? Daniel, the topic, I was just talking about the research papers I wrote. One was on Melkor from the Silmarillion, and the other one was on archetypes in the brain, the anatomy of the brain, and the way that archetypes map onto the brain symbolically, as well as potential for further inquiry and research on that topic. I do want to make some comments on the Dave Chappelle special, as well as the upcoming Bill Burr special, the comedians, as many of you are aware, because, and please feel free to write anything you want in the chat while I'm going to be all over the place today. My brain is fried. I'm not particularly focused, to be honest, but so I saw Chappelle live at Red Rocks, and he performed a lot of his most recent special there, and that was at the beginning of August, and I had been a huge Chappelle fan since I was about 12 years old, and I think, to be honest, that he performed as a cultural release valve for areas that we have now generated so much hostility, toxicity, and suppression and repression of, that he literally acted as a release valve for those tensions, and I think he's hilarious. I mean, I know the special was profoundly offensive, but I thought it was just like comic. It was hugely comically relieving, because there's so much taboo and tension, and especially for a guy like me who's spent so much time at the universities. there's just so much tension and hostility, and so to have a guy not give a shit and just be funny was a relieving thing. But everybody came after him, and it's Dave Chappelle. I mean, this guy in the '90s and early 2000s was like the liberal. Like like he was a face of the causes that many liberals have had across history. And now you look at how ridiculous it's gotten, and he's being demonized. He's a comedian. He's supposed to, like Jordan Peterson talks about this. The gesture in the court plays a fundamental role for the kingdom. And anyways, so basically, I just think it's ridiculous how it's generated so much hostility in the media. But Bill Burr, I saw a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I saw his show live, and I think he was working on the special that's about to release tomorrow. And it's just as offensive. And I know that it's just going to be like this double whammy, right? Dave Chappelle comes out, he irritates a bunch of people. Then Bill Burr, just wait. I mean, I don't know if you're into comedy, but if you watch Burr's special, you're going to be, oh my God, Ryan was right. This is pushing the edge of the envelope. So these two guys are going to hopefully move the cultural conversation forward in a way that we can talk about things even when we disagree, and it's okay to have freedom of speech. It's okay to talk about sensitive subjects as long as there's a mutual respect. And especially for comedians, it's essential that they can talk about whatever the fuck they want to talk about. They should be able to talk about that. Like, they should be able to make fun of everything. Nothing should be untouchable as a topic of comedy. And Peterson had a whole podcast on this. It was very good. It was just really addressing the importance of freedom of speech and how comedy is a fundamental symbol of that. And so, anyways, I think that what's about to happen, there's a couple potential things. Is one, everybody's going to get more culturally tense and pissed, or two, this is going to lead to some sort of healing for everybody because of the way that the comedians are able to touch things that nobody else can touch. I don't know what's going to happen. Anyways, I just wanted to address that briefly. All right, I'm going to shut my mouth for a second and let you all chime in. Let's see here. I'm going to refresh my page. Tense and I did not watch Never Ending Story. Sorry, Daniel. I haven't watched it yet. I'm going to look it up again. Never Ending. Okay, I've got it on my. I remember writing it on my list in July, and then my mom ended up getting sick, and I just forgot about it. So, anyways, sorry about that. I know I said I would. Anyways, what else is going on? Somebody say something. What else? What do you want me to talk about next? I'm here for your entertainment today. I've been gone for a while. You all have been patient and awesome in the Discord chat and all the other ways that you communicate with us. So I just want to, whatever is best for you all today, just tell me. Q&A open. I could talk about the brain paper that I wrote. I could talk a little bit about what I learned. We could get into anything you want to get into. What's up, Gregory? Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for being here. So you tell me what's next here. I'm just going to patiently wait for somebody to say anything, and I'll just go with that, as long as it's obviously appropriate for this conversation. I want you to sing opera. No, I'm not going to sing. I meant meaningful topics, Daniel. Meaningful topics. Not opera. Handedness? Okay, well, I mean, one thing that I know you are. I know you're joking, Daniel. But one thing, well, handedness in the brain. If it's that just handedness, the right side of your cerebral cortex and your brain controls the left side of your body. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. Same thing with eye movement and eye control, which is actually interesting because, you know, the cross wiring is actually also projected in Anthony Stevens. Yes. Oh, you can't see me. Adela says, I can't see you, Ryan. Only the chat? Oh, why can't you see me? Am I, what the? Can everybody else see me? Just say yes if you can see me. Is just so I can know. Yes or no. Can anybody else? Okay, so Gregory can see me. So I don't know what's going on, Adela, but I am seen by Gregory and Daniel, so maybe there's something going on with your computer. Anyways, so I'll talk about the... Okay, this is great. So we've got Gregory handedness as it relates to personality and brain organization. And then Dick Justice says, what did you learn in regards to archetypes mapping onto the brain? Okay, perfect. So we'll just dive right into both of those subjects. Okay, so I'm going to just make sure I have my notes here in front of me just to make sure. Oops. Let's see here. I'll pull up my... I know you can see my desktop, but I got to pull up my... paper here. You can see into my personal desktop here. Greek. All right, I just want to pull these notes up just so I have references. So yeah, just so you can see all my references here, just so you know that this is the research I did if you're looking at the screen. Okay, let me look at and I could just talk about it, but I just want to read part of it to you so you can kind of get a left and right brains. Okay, here, I'll read this part of you. Read this part of you? What the fuck? That's kind of a weird Freudian slip. I'll read this part of you. What does that even... All right, let me make this so you can see it. Oops, sorry. Having a little technical issues. You're so patient. Okay. Please don't go to big screen. Please don't go to big screen. Please don't go to big screen. Okay, here we go. Sarmath says, I like your Jordan Peterson vids. Oh, I'm so glad that you like the Jordan Peterson vids. That's fantastic. Thank you for saying that. I love Jordan Peterson. He's a very good scientist and a great psychologist. Okay, frontal lobes. No, that's not it. It's the right and left and right brains. Okay, here, we even have Peterson, speaking of Peterson. Left and right brains. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson shares that the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex have correlations with specific specializations and strengths. From Maps of Meaning, Sapolsky, obviously worldwide famous endocrinologist, Robert Sapolsky from Harvard, also points out the hemispheric distinction, but also adds that they are mostly subtle and have been widely overstated. Psychologist Michael C. Corballis piles on in stating that polarities of the right and left brain are broadly evoked in art, business, education, literary theory, and culture, but owe more to the power of myth than to scientific evidence. Criticism in hand, I still find the distinction to be valuable as a conceptual structure through which to explore brain states. The right brain is generally correlated with characteristics such as intuition, intuitive thinking, big picture concepts, emotional process, nonverbal states, pattern recognition, creativity, impulse, left field vision, and left side body control. Sapolsky, Peterson references there. The left brain, oops, let's see, the left brain. No, I found an error. Fuck. I worked so hard on this sucker and there's a spelling error. Now that is cruel. Ugh. Oh well. The left brain is correlated with analytical thought, details, order, rationality, verbality, logic, linearity, right side vision, and right side body control. Peterson. Sapolsky reference Corvallis also confirms that the right brain is responsible for left side vision and motor control, and the left brain opposite. These brain regions communicate via the information highway in the cerebrum, known as the corpus callosum. Now we're going to get into the interesting part here, and I'll elaborate on all this. Anthony Stevens, 2015, makes some fascinating connections about this in his book, Archetype Revisited. If you're interested in Jungian psychology and archetypes, by the way, highly recommend Anthony Stevens' book, Archetype Revisited. It's fantastic. Stevens suggests that much as we project our motor and vision control to the opposite side of the body, we have also projected archetypal meaning opposite to the side of the brain it is activated in. He lays out the archetypal right and left and convincingly points out that the right has traditionally been masculine, logistical, and ordered, while the left has taken on feminine, creative, emotional, etc. If this is true, it would have staggering implications in furthering my suggestion that humans project innate brain capacities onto external symbolism. So essentially, because if you look at all the archetypal and cultural symbolism of the right and left, obviously you can see that the right has always been the more masculine, logos-oriented path, and the left has been the left-hand path, the more feminine path, the more surrendered path, the more creative path. So what is that? That is so interesting, because obviously the right side of the brain is wiring over the left side of the body, left side of the brain is wiring over to the right side of the body. So could we possibly be actually projecting that out into our symbolic landscape? So Anthony Stevens, he's a lifelong Jungian analyst and psychiatrist. He's also an expert on things like attachment theory. He's really a scientist. He's biologically oriented, and he makes a great argument. Archetypal left and right brains map well onto the ancient Greek philosophers Aristotle and Plato. They were indeed not gods or myths. However, they have become household names and archetypal symbols for millions. Plato represents the left brain in his soul, the left brain in his, and I screwed this part up too. So he would be the right. Man, I'm so glad I'm reading this again, because Jesus. Okay, Plato represents the right brain in his soulful philosophy of forms and the allegory of the cave, hence he's more creative. Aristotle is the left brain, always striving for scientific truths in understanding observable detail. Together they work as a unit to create an interconnected network of ideas, much like the left and right brain work as a complex neural network, using the corpus callosum for information transference. There you go. So, that's that. But yeah, so essentially, let's see what Dick Justice has laughed my ass off. Yeah, essentially, the idea that the brain, and I'll talk more about the other parts. So we have the things like the brainstem and the cerebrum and the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, the whole limbic system. Then we have the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, where we're looking at the parietal lobes, occipital lobes, the temporal lobes, and the frontal lobes. And all of these you can map onto different archetypal images. So for example, Hermes, who's the messenger of Zeus, the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobes would be Zeus. Hermes would be the thalamus, all the neurons and information in the brain. Besides, there's a couple of select things like smell, for example, it doesn't go through the thalamus, but information typically gets sent through the thalamus, and the thalamus redistributes it to other aspects of the brain. So he's got that messenger capacity, that Hermes-like capacity. Also the magician in the thalamus. We talked about the magician. You are taking the constituent, elements of what you're doing is you're taking undifferentiated neurological chaos, and you're ordering it and sending it into particular regions of the brain so that it can map onto your functions and behavior. So that's a Hermes function. Zeus, represents the command of the frontal lobes, because Zeus had this. He was the the king of all the gods. He was the god. He ruled the kingdom. He was the king of gods and men, essentially. And his one of his totems was the eagle, and that represents the frontal lobe's ability to regulate motor control back to the occipital lobes and through the other motor control regions, as well as the frontal lobe's ability in general to regulate the limbic system in the brain. So the frontal lobes does have the ability to regulate your emotional and physiological centers. So it is kind of the king of the brain, so to speak. So I talked about things like that. I talked about Aphrodite and the posterior pituitary gland, which is responsible for the release of oxytocin, which is the love and bonding hormone. And I talked about the relationship. I'm talking so fast. I'm sorry, everyone. I think I'm talking too fast. Talked about the oxytocin and the relationship between the release of oxytocin and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what regulates your entire autonomic nervous system. Okay, so fight or flight, and then relax, rest, and digest. That's all. So those are your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, runs all the way down your spine. Your parasympathetic nervous system is just soothing, the digestion, the resting, the lowering of the heart rate. The sympathetic is the higher heart rate, the anxiety, anger, just its heightened activity in the sympathetic nervous system. So the hypothalamus is what regulates all that. Now, what's interesting is what I did was I took the god of war, Ares, as well as Dionysius, the god of wine, and I represent them as the polarities of the hypothalamus. So, for example, Ares can create a hypothalamic response of anger, aggression, violence, and anxiety, and fear. That's war. That is a great, perfect symbol for the sympathetic activation in war. Whereas Dionysius can create a complete parasympathetic regulation, shutdown, or even a if you think of inebriation, that's actually through that parasympathetic nervous system. It's loosening your inhibitions and things like that. Now, what's interesting is they were both lovers of Aphrodite. Ares and Dionysius were both lovers of Aphrodite. So I thought it was fascinating because the hypothalamus also regulates the posterior pituitary gland, which is right underneath it, which releases oxytocin. So I thought, okay, so we've got Aphrodite, and then we've got Ares and Dionysius, who are both lovers of, and I know this is heady stuff, so forgive me, who are both lovers of Aphrodite, sending signals, which is perfect. And then above that, you have the thalamus, which is Hermes, who is also a lover of Aphrodite. And the thalamus is what's responsible for sending the information to the hypothalamus for all the information that's being sorted and going out to different areas of the brain. So, oh man, this stuff is just so interesting to me. So I looked at all the different Greek symbolism. How does that map onto the brain? And how would that maybe help us understand brain anatomy as flashcards, but also understand how the archetypal is always at work within our neurophysiological substructures. It's always it's not like archetypes don't literally live inside your brain, obviously. That's ridiculous. But the mechanisms at play do map well onto the images of archetypes, which are very useful in understanding how humans work. So anyway, but what's interesting too is I looked at the thalamus, which is that information processing center, and the freeze response, right? So you say fight, flight, or freeze. Well, apparently the freeze response is when the thalamus is not processing information, and therefore no action is done because the information processing in the thalamus is overwhelmed. So anyways, the whole paper was about how the brain interacts with the limbic system and the brainstem, and how this kind of plays off of these Greek relationships between the gods. And it was really fun and interesting. Obviously, it's not totally empirical because, again, the gods don't literally live in your brain lobes. It's a metaphor. But some people don't understand that for some reason. Anyways. Do I believe in pheromones? I didn't realize that it was a topic up for discussion. Is it? I mean, no. I mean, I'm no biologist. I'm just trying to master the brain as much as I can, so that I can apply it to psychology. But I'm pretty sure pheromones are real. It says chemical substance produced and released to the environment by an animal, especially mammal, insect. Yeah, I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's a I don't think there's a debate about pheromones as far as I'm concerned. Yes, that's right. Hey, Grizz, welcome. That's right, Dick. The Greek gods are metaphysical representations of our biological processes. That's right, you nailed it. And what's also interesting is there is this part of the brain called the ventral media prefrontal cortex, and it helps to relate. It's at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex, and it helps to regulate the limbic system, which the limbic system is responsible for your heightened emotions, fight, flight, freeze, stuff like that. The ventral media cortex is essentially what I found was Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, right? Because it's regulating the ventral media prefrontal cortex is responsible for risk assessment and the regulation of anxiety and heightened amygdala responses, which is anxiety, fear, violence, etc., which runs through that hypothalamus that I talked about. So what's interesting, actually, I should pull up a picture of the brain so I can share with you. But what's interesting is that is regulating your limbic system. So if you get that part of your frontal lobes, the frontal cortex, to work for you, then essentially you have the ability to regulate your emotional responses. And so then I took a look at the myth of Medusa and Perseus. And Perseus obviously cut off the head of Medusa. I'm going to pull up the picture of the brain here. Sorry, the whistling was kind of annoying. At least it sounded like that in my headphones. Let's just see if this works here. Let's go window capture. Okay. I just want to kind of show you what I'm talking about. So this is the frontal lobes here, so you can see what I'm trying to say. And so at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex, so I think it would be like around here, this is the whole cerebral cortex. So this is the outer layers of the brain. But yeah, it would be the ventral media cortex. Now in the center of the brain, underneath these cerebrum layers, there is obviously the major limbic system functions. So we've got the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the posterior pituitary gland, the hippocampus, stuff like that. So, but basically what happens here is that ventral media cortex is able to regulate the limbic system, so it's able to help you with risk assessment and fear. If you have damage to that area of your brain, the regulation of your violent impulses, any frontal lobe damage, actually any prefrontal cortex frontal lobe damage, is going to severely increase the chance of you being a violent person. But anyway, so what I found was, from a Greek perspective, for Athena, the goddess Athena, is right there. War and wisdom, okay? What does it mean to be the goddess of war and wisdom? It means that you're able to wisely assess risk, know when to fight, and know when not to. So there's that wisdom component of the ventral media cortex, which sends that signaling to the rest of the brain that helps you to regulate those impulses. So I looked at Medusa as the limbic system. Fight, flight, freeze. Obviously, Medusa, when she stared at you, you would turn to stone. Men would turn to stone, it was said. And so Athena gave Perseus her shield, which he was able to use to reflect, which means that's a metaphor for the frontal cortexes, the prefrontal cortexes, and the ventral media cortex ability to reflect on your own emotional processes. And that regulates But what in the story, he uses the shield to reflect, so he didn't have to make direct eye contact with Medusa. It regulated his fear, so he didn't go into a thalamic freeze response and lose that encounter with Medusa. So he was regulating his fear through the symbolic help of Athena, the ventral media cortex. Then Hermes, the thalamus, gave him his sword. So he was able to spot Medusa with the shield and use the sword of Hermes, which is the thalamus, to discerningly cut off Medusa's head. So a flood of neurons came through the thalamic Hermes and severed the snake, which is the snake-like head, which is a ancient. Our primary response to snakes is freeze, and so that's an ancient biological circuitry. It mobilized the thalamus so it could act, and he cut off Medusa's head. When I hit that metaphor, I was fucking amazed. I was like, that is perfect. That's probably the best part of the whole paper I wrote. Everything else was fine, and I'm not tooting my own horn here. Like, I'm a total fucking novice at all this as far as I'm concerned. I've got 4 more years till I get my PhD, so I'm not considering myself an expert. I want to be an expert someday on the brain and all this stuff, but I say this humbly. When I hit that metaphor, that analogy, I was really excited because it was like, that's it. Athena, Perseus, Medusa, and Hermes. That's the regulation of the limbic system. The story of Medusa is a story that the Greeks created about the regulation of the limbic system, about the regulation of the fight, flight, freeze response. Man, that was so fucking cool. So I know, Gregory, if your kids are watching, sorry if I'm cursing, tell me if they are. I try to be mindful of that when you're watching. Okay, I'm gonna pull up. I'm gonna resize this. Pull up the chat. Where did I put the chat? Oh, it's on my phone here. Let me refresh it. Grizz says, "Is that where she came out of Zeus's forehead? Is that where I couldn't tell if you were joking? Is that where she came out?" Well, the ventral media cortex and the prefrontal cortex are both aspects of the PFC, but apparently according to Robert Sapolsky, apparently the ventral media prefrontal cortex is a extension of the PFC, and so it's kind of part of it, but kind of not, I guess. So I guess Zeus and Athena, in the way that I conceptualized it, would be different. Gregory says, "I, for one, will admit to having been under the spell of witchy women and their wonderful smells." And, oh, you also said the pheromone debate is whether or not male humans can be controlled like male praying mantises. Oh, I see. Yeah, I'm not aware of that, and something I probably should study. I'm not fully aware of it. Dr. Strachan is really helping me understand biology. Right now, I'm really feeling like I'm getting a brain study going. My study of the rest of the human body is definitely sorely lacking. I'm starting to go into those areas because I think it's important, because my special interest is psychology. So I think it's important. And I gotta say, I just want to admit, finding that error in my paper really bums me out, because I didn't see it. And maybe I'm being too hard on myself, but that's still lingering in the back of my head. Anyways, God, because not the one where I had the one spelling error, but the right and the left getting crossed up. That's annoying. But when you write, like, I don't know how, for those of you who have done research papers or anything, when you're doing it for days and days straight, your brain starts getting a little foggy. So I'm wondering if I should have slowed down a little bit and took another day. But oh well, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's a very minor thing. Okay. Hazy, Welcome. I'm glad you're here. You say, this is so interesting. Hi, Ryan. Nice to meet you all. Nice to meet you too. Welcome. We're really glad you're here. Is that where she? No, she didn't. So, Grizz, she didn't come out of Zeus's forehead. The ventral media, its cortex, is closer to the limbic system than the PFC. The PFC is at the front. You got a Greek god for the pineal. What part of the brain is too hard on yourself? Well, that would be limbic. Being too hard on myself would be limbic system. It would be, feelings of anxiety or shame. I wonder what shame, because let's see, I'm going to look this up real quick. Shame biocircuitry, something I didn't do enough research on. But yeah, limbic system is responsible for most of a lot of our human emotions. There's a bit of a debate about exactly how much. They say the frontal lobes are responsible for the coloring of our emotions, like almost the personality of them, but the deep physiological roots are in the limbic system, apparently. Let's see here. I got to get into the APA database. I bet you'll have a paper on shame in the brain. I got to get into that. It'll take me a second here. Olaf, are you actually in Greece? Because I've been talking about Greek archetypes in the brain. So that would blow my mind if you were actually in Greece. Yeah, it's here in Colorado. It's 10:18 a.m. What time is it in Greece? Are you serious? You're in Greece? That's fucking sweet. Okay, so I'm gonna open this research database. Let's look at shame and the brain. I love this database. It's sweet. You got all these peer-reviewed journals. Brain. Wow. So, Glaf, that's so cool. You say, I am in Greece right now. I'm currently in Kalambaka / I don't know if I'm pronouncing Meteora. Glaf, if you get a chance to go back and listen to some of this, I went through a bunch of archetypes of the Greek gods in the brain and how they map onto the anatomy, and I think you might think it's interesting. Okay, increased amygdala response to shame. Okay, let's see. And then there's another article on guilt-specific processing in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, let's look at this. I like increased amygdala response in shame. Okay, we'll read the abstract here. This is by, let's see, who's this by? A bunch of people. This is an academic journal from the University of Manchester by Erdem Pulku, Karen Leith, Rebecca Elliott, Sophie Green, George Moll, John Deacon, and Roland Zahn. Okay, so this is a legitimate academic peer-reviewed journal from 2014. Abstract. Proneness to self-blaming or self-blaming moral emotions, such as shame and guilt, is increased in major depressive disorder. Okay. And I do have depression. Sometimes it's getting a lot better, and may play an important role in vulnerability even after symptoms have subsided. Social psychologists have argued that shame proneness is relevant for depression. Obviously, I mean, anybody who's been depressed probably relates to that, I would guess. And vulnerability and is distinct from guilt. Shame depends on the imagined critical perception of others, whereas guilt results from one's own judgment. Oh, interesting. The neuroanatomy of shame is shame and MDD, major depressive disorder, is unknown. Using fMRI, we compared 21 participants with major depressive disorder, remitted from symptoms with no current morbid axis 1 disorders. Using 18 control participants and no personal family history, personal or family history. The major depressive group exhibited higher activation of the right amygdala and posterior insula for shame relative to guilt. Okay, so we know those are two parts. The posterior insula and right amygdala are responsible for feelings of shame, at least activated during feelings of shame. This neural difference was observed despite equal results of rated negative emotional valence. Valence means emotional value. It's a psychological word. And frequencies of induced shame and guilt experienced across groups. These same results were found in medication-free MDD subgroup, increased amygdala and posterior insula activations known to be related to sensory perception of emotional stimuli, distinguished shame from guilt responses, and remitted major depressive disorder. I'll finish this here. It's almost done. People with major depressive disorder thus exhibit changes in the neural response to shame after symptoms have subsided. This supports the hypothesis that shame and guilt play at least partly distinct roles in vulnerability to major depressive disorder. Shame induction may be a more sensitive probe of residual amygdala hypersensitivity in MDD compared with facial emotion evoked responses previously found to normalize on remission. That's just the abstract. There's a whole 20-page journal ahead. Anyway, so these journals can be dense, so it's kind of a pain to sift through them sometimes. But anyways, that actually makes a lot of sense, Grizz. I'm glad that you brought that up because I do think that it would make sense what they're saying, that shame is a response within the amygdala and the posterior insula that is reacting to what other people might perceive of my own mistakes. So that's interesting. That's very interesting. So that would make sense with the paper, feeling upset about the mistakes in the paper. Oh, sweet. 7:18 p.m. in Greece. Wow. Well, I hope you have an awesome time, and that's such a great opportunity to travel. And you bought Plato's Dialogues, and you're gonna be in Santori. You're gonna be in Santori in 2 days reading it. That's awesome, and I'll go back into those. Justin, welcome. Davidi. Gloff says also Greece is fantastic. Greece is a fantastic country, and I recommend anyone who has the means to go at least once. I'd love to go to Greece someday. I know my brother's been there. Very cool. Just posted a JBP clip concerning shame and shamefulness in the Discord server. As always, it is good food for thought. Can you post it in here, Gregory? I'd love to hear what he says. Actually, I could even play it for a minute on this stream if you have access to it right now. If not, that's okay. Gloff says, we as a society could use a bit more shame. I don't know. It's all context dependent, but that's an interesting idea. I mean, obviously shame was a survival, it's an evolutionary strategic survival circuit that was developed partially I would assume for social normalization and social cohesion and order. Links will not paste. Oh yeah, that's right, Gregory, you're right. Bummer. That's all right. Anyways, what else, everybody? What else do you want to talk about? Thanks for entertaining me while I Gregory says that's very odd coming from a bigot, racist, homophobe. What do you mean, Grizz? Grizz said that. What do you mean by that? What's odd? And who's the homophobe, racist? Thanks for me. Yeah, Grizz, clarity on that. Oh, somebody asked to read my paper. Shoot, who was that? Did I read that comment? Somebody said I'd like to Dick Justice. Sorry, man, I forgot about that. Did I address that? Yes, you can read my paper. and you just started university. Oh, sorry, I missed out on these comments. I'm sorry, Dick Justice. Yeah, I have a Google Drive. Um, I have a Google Drive link where I can share with you this paper. Are you on our Discord server? I'll put it in one of the Discords. Hazy Bazy says, if you have to read out from what you were reading, if you have to read out from what you were reading, you mean read my paper? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Or the journal. And Grizz says, more shame versus leftist nonsense. Oh, I see. Yeah, I don't know about that. I'd have to really think about that, guys. Oh, I was reading from a journal of a psychological journal. Or are you talking about the Greek paper, the archetype in the brain paper that I wrote? Or are you talking about the neural origins of shame and depression? Because I could read my whole paper if you wanted. I would be fine to do that. Or I could at least read more of it. That could kind of be a fun way to get through this. Yeah, but I don't. And just clarify, Hazy B, and I'd be happy to do whatever it is that you're asking. See ya, Gloff. Have fun in Greece. Have fun swimming. Okay. Oops, I didn't mean to. Yeah, I don't know about this whole we need more shame idea. We could. I mean, that could be a. I'm skeptical about that idea, to be honest. So, I don't think it's a bad idea necessarily, but I'm not sure. It's a very complicated question. So, okay, I'll read some of my paper. Just and if you get bored, then you can leave. That's fine. Oh, you can see two of me. That's not normal. Okay, I guess that's a function of the Discord that I'm put up in the corner here. That's fine. Or the OBS, sorry, Discord. Hazy Bazy, why do you say we need more shame? I don't think we need more shame. I don't say that. I think that's probably not the case. I think that there's a lot of other things that we could do with more of, personally. Okay. So I'll read this sucker to you. Grizz, if you feel up for it, will you please post the Discord link so that Hazy Bazy here can join? And anybody else who wants to? Okay. This is what I've got so far. And disclaimer, I might need to rework some of it, but this is the culmination of the work I've done so far. The archetypal brain, an anatomical and symbolic exploration. In the post-Jungian world of modern science, we are at liberty to take a closer look at the physiological relevance of the archetypal. The archetypes of the collective psyche fit into our human neurophysiology in fascinating ways. Archetypes are qualified as inherited aspects of the phylogenetic psyche, which essentially implies an a priori receptivity to the images of the collective psyche. And by the way, just so everyone knows, I'm not going to read you every paraphrase reference. If you want the references, I'll put them in the Discord or in the description so you can see all the sources and the authors that these things are based off. I will read the authors of direct quotes, or if it's part of the text, but I won't read the paraphrased brackets if there is no mention of the author in the direct text. The specific scope of the writing herein is exploring archetypes that map onto brain mechanisms and functioning. I wish to reanimate the brain and posit an overlap between brain constructs and the ancient Greek archetypes. This study is meant to convey that there is an interdisciplinary intersection between neuroanatomy and depth psychological inquiry. This is a small contribution to the larger project of reanimating scientific thinking. The lens is narrowed to Greek archetypes and Jungian statements to provide a stable analogy and simplify the integration. Reanimating the brain is an ensouling of modern scientific findings with personified images. In this analysis, I hope to accomplish two primary goals: to utilize the power of metaphorical symbolism by bringing otherwise reductionistic mechanisms to life, and to further convey that archetypal experiences are brain experiences also. When an experience of an archetype is at play, there are brain functions that create direct physiological and emotional effects and are analogously related. This is not an attempt to reduce the archetype to the body, but rather to show how archetypes work through the body. I must admit this research is additionally a selfish exercise in my desire to understand the brain comprehensively. I am keenly aware that archetypes serve as powerful flashcards for neuroanatomical memorization. I hope the reader may enjoy the same effect of enhanced learnability. I also state my ulterior motive to inform the reader of any potential bias and empirical limitations. Just going to check the comments here to make sure. All right, I'm going to keep going. So next section, an animated expression of the brain and its archetypal relevance. The brain is a multi-layered organ in which complex functions are interweaved. Each brain region has its expertise. However, there is significant shared responsibility in multifarious jobs in select regions. Psychologist and scientist Dr. Roger Strachan emphasizes the necessity of viewing the brain acting as a whole and refraining from oversimplifying functions to isolated regions. That being granted, it is helpful to view the organ globally and categorically separate regions and functions. Within the categorical functions, neuroscience professor John E. Dowling explains all brain processes are enabled by the signaling of neurotransmitters through neural networks. These cellular electrical signals fire rapidly throughout the brain and the body to activate necessary procedures. The highly acclaimed neuropsychologist Jack Panksepp points out that it is now clear that every human psycho-emotional experience is tightly correlated with specific brain activity. Insofar as humans can be said to have a phenomenological experience, it is also granted that brain activity is stimulating that experience, the experience. The brain is at the very least the primary vehicle through which archetypal experience is transmitted. Therefore, if archetypes can be said to exist, they must, by necessity of logic, be compatibly resonant with the biological hardwiring of human nature. Humanity tends to project its innate qualities onto myth. The innate biological self sees its own reflection through projective mechanisms. Jung, 1968, wrote about the external projections of the archetypes, which are ultimately facets of oneself. In themselves, archetypal images are amongst the highest values of the human psyche. They have peopled the heavens of all races from time immemorial. To discard them as valueless would be a distinct loss. Our task is not, therefore, to deny the archetype, but to dissolve the projections, in order to restore their contents to the individual who has involuntarily lost them by projecting them outside himself. Jung also stated, "It is in my view a great mistake to suppose the psyche of a newborn child is a tabula rasa, in the sense that there is absolutely nothing in it, insofar as the child is born with a differentiated brain that is predetermined by heredity and therefore individualized." Jung goes on to explain that each human will develop their own unique personality based on these inherent traits. These statements elucidate the importance of looking at the brain as a perceptual hardwiring for archetypal experience. Even as in this exposition, oops, you can't even see the whole paper. Hold on a second, sorry. My bad. I was just paying attention to that. Let's see. That's better. Not quite perfect, but better. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm almost done with this. There we go. There we go. Okay, even as in this exposition I am outlining the brain as a shared perceptual map, it is essential to also research the innately nuanced subpersonalities of the individual. I have addressed the biological roots of subpersonalities at length elsewhere. Being that humans share the reality of having a brain, there are many structures that can be empirically generalized about so long as the nuance of the individual is factored in. Understanding innate hardwiring seems to be an essential piece of the puzzle in addressing archetypal reality. However, the biological framework should not eradicate spiritual premises on the issue of spirituality and of science and spirituality. Let us leave some ambiguity between spirit and psyche, in which there is room for a greater mystery, and awe, and reverence for the immaculate formation of the universe as we experience its contents. Yes, the brain is responsible for transmitting our felt experience, and yes, there is a greater force at play that allows these experiences to come through. The archetypal can therefore be qualified as when the mysterious other from the unknown is met, engaged, or personified through the individual body-mind. With that disclaimer in hand, I proceed with a deeper exploration of the archetypal transmitting device we call the brain. Brainstem and cerebellum. Jungian analyst Anthony Stevens points out the brainstem and cerebellum are two of the most evolutionary ancient parts of the brain. They are located right above the spinal cord. These brain capacities are found in all reptiles as well as animals and humans. They have widely been referred to as the reptilian brain. It is inferred that reptiles, animals, and humans share these brain components, but reptiles don't show further neuroanatomical development. Dowling elaborates on the brainstem with a basic conceptual synopsis. The brainstem is comprised of three components: the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla is responsible for regulating autonomic, meaning automatic, functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, etc. The pons is active in receiving motor control and sensory input from the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, and passes it on to the cerebellum, which is responsible for coordination and things like that. Medical doctor James Austin, 1999, fills in that the midbrain assists with vision, hearing, and body movement. These ancient structures of the brainstem are ripe with archetypal significance and symbolic meaning. The animated brainstem functions as the automatic life. It is akin to the human experience of the sun, the moon, the wind, the stars, and nature's cycles. There we go, another little mistake here. Minor. They simply exist regardless of conscious volition. The brainstem's functions are then taken as part of life's implicit process. It is automatic that one breathes or has a beating heart, just as the sun typically rises and falls. The archetypal analogy of the brainstem is of nature as it immediately impacts us. The Greek human bull minotaur works perfectly here as half man, half beast. Even as humans have evolved to be socially complex and sophisticated, the human psyche is weighed down by the minotaur. Is it the minotaur? The minotaur within. Humans will also always have to deal with their base instincts. Jung writes, in the primitive world, everything has psychic qualities. Everything is endowed with the element of man's psyche, or let's say the human psyche, of the collective unconscious, for there is as yet no individual psychic life. Jung's comments on the ancient psyche is a fitting summation on the contour of the brainstem from an archetypal perspective. Life is simply automatically occurring at this level of the brain. There is no complex differentiation or nuanced personality development. Therefore, all aspects of nature and self are as automatic functions to which there is only a passive observer. The cerebellum, on the other hand, is responsible for coordination, balance, posture, motor learning, and athletic mobility. One can imagine the importance of these brain functions for a basic life of survival. A deer swiftly gallops through the pine forest. Her footfalls are gracefully and precisely placed as she weaves her way through the trees at an incredible pace. An ancient spearman goes into battle and dominates enemies with intense concentration and mobility. Every movement is deadly. Scientists Mark Baer, Barry Connors, and Michael Paradiso explain the cerebellum in Latin means little brain, and it is no wonder why. The athletic component of existence is an archetypal world all on its own. It is the brutish strength of Hercules, the swift movement of Hermes, and the precise aim of Apollo. Coordinated mobility is an aspect of human existence that we have been steeped in for thousands of years. Initially, it was a simple survival mechanism, and it evolved to serve also as a form of play and competition. The thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus is located above the brainstem towards the center of the brain. It serves as a router for the entire brain by processing and redistributing information to various regions. The thalamus is a messenger, sorting and redistributing information like the god Hermes. Edith Hamilton explains that Hermes was the emissary of Zeus and that he appears oftener in the tales of mythology than any other god, just as the thalamus appears prolifically as a brain emissary. As the divine messenger, Hermes has the responsibility of sorting out what's important and redistributing it to others. This represents the thalamic ability to create order out of undifferentiated chaos and redistribute something of value to the cerebrum and other areas such as the hypothalamus. So we talked about the archetype of the magician earlier, and that's also a similar function. Medical doctor Jeffrey Walsh explains the hypothalamus controls and regulates the autonomic nervous system, by the way, which is made up of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. This means it is responsible for states of fight or flight and rest and digest. The hypothalamus is sending signals based on the needs of the present moment. It will either create arousal or calming effects depending on the response needed. If there is a threat, it will drive the nervous system into fight or flight. If there is a safe and calm environment, it may create a soothing effect. The hypothalamus receives data from the thalamus and signals for hormone release via the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is the secretor of our state of being. Are we at peace? Are we in shock, fear, excitement, rage, or love? There are several archetypes that represent the hypothalamic aspect of life. The Greek gods Ares and Dionysius hold a hypothalamic edge as they represent polarities of an Ares-like sympathetic nervous system arousal and a complete Dionysian parasympathetic relaxation. So that's arousal, fight or flight, relaxation, rest and digest. Ares, as the god of war, positions himself nicely in the hypothalamus as a sympathetic nervous system response involving the emotions of war. Anger, violence, fear, and anxiety are all hypothalamic responses to amygdala activity. The amygdala performs as a threat alarm system for the hypothalamic and limbic functions. Explicitly speaking, anger, violence, fear, and anxiety are all fundamental experiences in war. Dionysius, as the god of wine, is a great image of the hypothalamic response to more relaxing circumstances. His wine is a good example as inebriation creates a hypothalamic response through the parasympathetic nervous system. Ironically, both gods of the hypothalamus were lovers of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who is represented through the posterior pituitary gland's release of oxytocin, the love and bonding hormone. The hypothalamus, Ares and Dionysius send complex signals to the posterior pituitary gland, Aphrodite located beneath them. It is important not to forget Hermes, who is in the thalamus above, also a lover of Aphrodite and responsible for passing neurological signals to the hypothalamus. It is easy to imagine that at this stage of the brain we are still dealing with ancient survival structures and have not yet broached the unique aspects of the forebrain that make humans distinct from other creatures. The regulation and dysregulation of the nervous system is an ancient experience to both humans and animals. The basic questions of survival and safety are primary here. There are several archetypal images and imprints that have been instantiated to assist human beings with this difficult aspect of existence for thousands of years. The limbic system is a perfect midway exploration from the lower brain layers to the more advanced cerebral cortex. The limbic system. The limbic system is regarded by many scientists as one of the primary drivers of human emotion, although there is still a discrepancy about the specifics amongst experts. It is a combination of the thalamus, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. The hypothalamus processes complex signaling and induces what is well known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. The adjacent amygdala is also deeply involved here as it is activated for both fear and aggression. The hippocampus is responsible for converting short-term memory into long-term memory. The amygdala communicates signals for fear, anger, violence, and anxiety to the hypothalamus via the thalamus. The freeze response is also utilized in circumstances where fighting or fleeing are no longer viable options, and the thalamus stops processing information properly. Daniel Siegel provides a perfect summation of the limbic system in his book, The Mindful Brain. The limbic region evolved when reptiles developed into mammals. Limbic zones are involved in attachment or connections to our caregivers, memory, especially processing events into factual and autobiographical forms, the appraisal of meaning, the creation of affect, and our inner sensations of emotion. The limbic regions also contain the master hormone regulator, the hypothalamus, enabling direct influences to the body proper. Siegel's comments on the limbic system make clear the pervasive effects it has on emotional life. Limbic response adds context to a wide variety of human experience. The archetypal relevance of these brain regions is particularly palpable. The myth of Medusa and Perseus is a robust starting point for further insight. Medusa is the epitome of the limbic system's fight, flight, or freeze response. The mere sight of her was said to turn man to stone, which is representative of a biological freeze response. Thus, one would be driven at all costs to avoid her gaze. Of course, one heroic Perseus managed to cut off her head. So we're looking at a fight or flight dynamic here. He avoided the freeze response by using Athena's shield. Athena is the goddess of war and wisdom, and represents the ability to regulate one's nervous system and calmly and consciously make choices. Being the goddess of war and wisdom implies knowing how to manage aggressive impulses wisely. Athena then is symbolic of the brain module known as what Professor Robert Sapolsky calls the ventral media prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, an extension behind the prefrontal cortex. Athena's shield, the VMPFC, enabled Perseus to use it as a mirror and avoid direct eye contact with Medusa. The mirror represents the reflective power of the VMPFC. Using the brain to self-reflect is an effective tool in emotional regulation. The shield symbolizes protection from nervous system dysregulation. The VMPFC has the unique ability to regulate and overcome impulsive physiological responses, i.e. fight, flight, freeze, and command action deliberately and consciously. It is fitting then that Perseus managed to use Athena's shield to overcome being frozen by Medusa's gaze. He then used the sword granted to him by Hermes, a flood of neurons through the thalamus, to sever Medusa's head. Hermes, being symbolic of the thalamus, allowed the discerning stroke of his mighty sword through Perseus' hands. Trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk shares some helpful information in understanding Hermes' thalamic sword's role in mobilizing Perseus' victory. The dysfunction and stultification of the thalamus can create a terrifying, helpless inability to act. Van der Kolk furthers these insights in stating, in normal circumstances, the thalamus also acts as a filter or gatekeeper. This makes it a central component of attention, concentration, and new learning, all of which are compromised by trauma. This places the typical freezing response to Medusa's horrible glare into context. The thalamus is not processing information signaling, so cannot act, hence the body freezes. With the help of Hermes and Athena, Perseus can regulate his fear and execute a discerning strike of the sword. In summation, the ventral media prefrontal cortex regulates the limbic system and allows fluidly effective thalamic processing. Perseus' slaying of Medusa is a brilliant myth that intuitively conveys the human brain's capacity to overcome automatic stress responses and make conscious choices. Oops. The parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Let me just read the comics, make sure nobody's... Okay, I'll keep reading. The parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, features of the cerebral cortex. The lobes of the cerebral cortex and the sensory aspects of the brain are responsible for the 5 senses we experience as touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell. The cerebral cortex separates complex mammals from cold-blooded vertebrates, while the prefrontal cortex in humans separates them from the rest of the animal kingdom, along with some other unique factors. The parietal lobe is in the upper regions of the forebrain. It is responsible for what's known as proprioception, which is the body's awareness of its own sense of location in space. Parietal functioning is essential in general somatosensory processing. The goddess Artemis is a succinct match for the parietal lobe. Jungian scholar Sally Nichols writes, Artemis, Diana, goddess of the animals, is a wild creature untamed and unpredictable. Nichols goes on to explain that no matter how evolved we become as a species, we can never leave behind our animal bodies. Artemis embraces the somatosensory aspect of experience of life. She also reminds us to be mindful of our own bodily instincts, lest they take control of us and spur unrestrained self-destruction. The return of the Minotaur. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the forebrain. It is responsible for our sight perception and visual orientation. The cyclops is, amongst many other things, a proper occipital symbol. Hamilton writes, Cyclops, the wheel-eyed, had only one enormous eye, as round and big as a wheel, in the middle of the forehead. The large eye in the middle of the forehead represents the frontal lobe's capacity to send control signals to the occipital lobe for eye movement. The temporal lobe is located at the bottom of the forebrain. It is responsible for auditory processing and memory storage, and is engaged in teasing out coherent concepts from linguistic sounds. The god Apollo is best placed in the temporal lobe. His love of poetry, music, and dance symbolizes the temporal lobe's ability to process complex sounds. He was also said to be a direct link between gods and men, guiding men to know the divine will, showing them how to make peace with the gods. Music and dance, of course, is also a way to remember the gods. In his temporal listening, Apollo makes connections and performs his innate healing ability. The gustatory cortex is located on the outer parts of the frontal lobe and is responsible for taste perception. Barrett, Connors, and Paradiso explain the main flow of taste information is from the taste buds to the primary gustatory axons in the brainstem up to the thalamus and to the cerebral cortex. The olfactory bulb is located at the bottom right front of the brain, is responsible for smell. Interestingly, the olfactory bulb does not send information through the thalamus like other parts of the brain. Smell and taste are experienced as an overlapping sensation in the brain. For smell and taste, the goddess Hestia is elected as a primary symbol. Hestia was the Greek goddess of home, hearth, and was prayed to before and after every meal. Food is the convergence of smell and taste and is also symbolic of home, comfort, and family. Hestia was also ritualized with newborn babies, solidifying the sacred shelter of taste and smell. Taste and smell are also one of the primary ways humans navigate their sense of physical and psychological sanitation. For example, if one is physiologically repulsed by the smell of garbage, it activates the same place in the brain as one's disgust sensitivity to a moral transgression. This outlines the importance. Oops, gotta plug in my keyboard here. Out of battery. This outlines the importance of having Hestia's. This outlines the importance of having Hestia's blessing for a physically safe and morally sound household imbued with an aroma of nurturing smell and taste. Having tallied off the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, along with smell and taste circuits, there is one more brain region of primary importance. The frontal lobes are categorically separate because they are an important feature of the human personality. The frontal lobes, features of the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobes are unique evolutionary features in advanced primates. They organize aspects of human movement, speech intention, personality expression, emotional expression and control, and eye movement. The frontal lobes also communicate with the brainstem via the thalamus to indicate complex body movement and intentions and procedures. Finally, it is worth emancipating the prefrontal cortex as a feature of the frontal lobes. The PFC is the latest extension of the frontal lobes, is unique to humans, and responsible for planning, reasoning, and general human rationale. This part of the brain gets credit. I'm really glad I'm rereading this. I'm finding little things all over the place. Good thing it's not due until Wednesday. This part of the brain gets credit for our cities, businesses, universities, philosophies, and complex social dynamics. Zeus is a perfect representation of the frontal lobes. David Studdard outlines that Zeus was the commander of earth and sky. He ruled over gods and humans alike. The command the frontal lobes have over the rest of the brain gives credence to Zeus' occupation therein. Zeus also held a special relationship with the eagles and was able to utilize their mighty wings to fly fast and far, keeping watch over all things. The eagle is well known for its sharpness of sight. The visual range and precision of the eagle nestles nicely within the framework of the frontal lobes, as they send neurons to communicate with the occipital lobe and midbrain to control visual focus and eye movement. Zeus also employed the god Hermes, the thalamus, to be his great messenger. The thalamus, as previously mentioned, receives instructions from the frontal lobes to communicate with other regions. Zeus employs Hermes as a messenger to keep order and rule within his vast kingdom, just as the frontal lobes communicate with the thalamus to regulate the brain. The subject of frontal lobe function and PFC, prefrontal cortex, faculties brings us to the cliched left and right brain. The left and right brain are helpful tools for understanding. I already read this part to you, so I'm going to skip it. Conclusion. This attempt to portray the brain's innate mechanisms as having archetypal relevance is an ongoing dialectical process, impartial at best. The material provided is a hermeneutic attempt in bridging the archetypal and scientific through means of philosophical observation. Since humans all have brains, it is implicit that the brains are fundamental aspects of experience. However, I have not ruled out the premise of soul or otherwise metaphysical capacities and personally feel intuitively inclined towards those beliefs. The mythological images of the ancient Greeks provide rich parallels for understanding complex brain mechanisms. Ultimately, these are metaphors that have the dual intentions of creating enhanced learnability and showing how brain functions are represented through myth. There are limits to the metaphors, and I found myself stretching to make some connections, which shows an opportunity for growth in my research. More critical analysis is necessary to do justice to the potential of this research, although I do maintain the archetypal core I was attempting to strike. Generally, the brain is immaculately connected to the world of archetypes. Many of the parallels are too uncanny to discard without further investigation. Much like the world of archetypes, the brain is a complex organ with multitudinous aspects. Therefore, it is unwise to limit any one part of the brain to one definition. The truth is much more complicated. Archetypes in kind are also not beholden to a single definition, and their nebulous nature is proven through the various analogies and polarities they generate. Also, everyone's genome is unique, which means brains will portray both similarities and differences in expressive capacity. Further areas for inquiry would certainly include consciousness and genetic differences in personality. Brain scientists have found no satisfying explanation for consciousness. It would stand to reason that the archetypes may be ubiquitous forms of consciousness that span beyond our physiological structures, but also map onto them. The genetic contribution to personality continues to be a controversial subject and bears further investigation. This could greatly assist in understanding why people resonate with different archetypes. Done. Okay, and there's all the references. My throat hurts now. Hermeneutic, not thermeneutic. Grizz. Hermeneutic is a research method. It's a type of research that involves the epistemological approach of bridging and alchemizing different ideas. So a hermeneutic approach would be an approach of distilling information down and creating philosophical concepts that might bridge across different territories, but also is more a form of philosophical inquiry. It's not scientific research. Like scientific quantitative research would be like, you know, I do a lab study or a massive survey or something like that. Qualitative research is more utilizing your own faculties of critical assessment and going from there. So there's a bunch of different types of research. Hazy Basie said, it glitches and flipped me back in 6 minutes. Had to get out of the video and back on. The paper is great. Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I'm sorry that you had some issues there. And I am starting to get extremely tired, to be honest. So I'll just get through some of these comments, but I need to hop off here in a second. Yes, it's a Hermes approach. Exactly. Hermeneutic actually has the root word of Hermes in it, so that's right, Grizz. That's perfectly stated. All right. Boy Meets World says, that's great, man. Thank you very much. Grizz says, Greek god archetype and brain function is a beautiful like a venue. Boy Meets World said, I may have missed this part, but do you have any idea how these stories evolved and why they match up to so much to modern biology and physiology and psychology? I'm not sure. Like, that's the mystery. It's like, that's what I wanted to figure out is there a match? And I think that, well, Jung had this idea that we have this thing called the image-making instinct. And I think that's what it is. We have this instinct, this image-making instinct, through which we want to project our own faculties out so that we can see them. So it's like Zeus is a personified representation of an actual process that's going on inside of a human being. And we use these myths and images to discover who we are. So they're like archetypal mirrors. They're reflective devices. But the thing is, for most of human history, we weren't aware that we were projecting. So we took everything literally. Literally, Zeus is out there. Literally, this is happening. And while all of that is a whole different metaphysical discussion, we know that at the very least, these are projections of things that are happening inside of us. And, most primitive societies and ancient societies didn't understand. People like Carl Jung began to understand this, that we're projecting our own innate capacities outside. That's amazing to think about. And through these projections, they're truths that are coming out of us and getting represented in mythology and these beautiful poems and stories and these soulful expressions of who we are. And then through brain science, we've mechanistically and scientifically reduced things to small minutiae. And I want to show that these little small minutiae are they're not separate from the beauty of the mythological world. They're not separate from the poetic faculties that we enjoy, or the stories that we love to watch on TV or read in books, or go to church and hear about, or whatever. They're all, everything is connected. We're all connected. Nothing is on an island of its own. Neurology and science is not separate from spirituality and self-development and mythology and religion. It's all one big organismic function, and I want to narrow the gap between these things, because I think it's a misnomer that there's a separation. I think it's not that there's not a separation, it's just we don't understand exactly how these things work. I don't subscribe to the belief that religion is a mind virus like Richard Dawkins. I don't subscribe to the belief that it's an error in nature's evolution. I think that religion and mythology is fundamental aspects of who we are, and that's what's beautiful about it. And so when we look at these archetypes and images, they can always relate back to certain qualities of our own being. And all the representations that I used in that paper, while they work for certain analogies, remember, archetypes are vast, just like brain components are vastly complicated, and it's not just one or the other. Like the Cyclops could have been a symbol for many different things, and I chose to use it for the frontal lobes control through the occipital lobes, and because that is what worked for the particular angle I was taking. So we have to remember archetypes are nebulous, which means that they can serve multiple different narrative functions at once, just like brain functions are nebulous. They're not isolated. They're serving many things. They're always happening at once in the brain. It's not nothing's happening on an island. It's not like the amygdala is operating on its own and the rest of the brain is just watching it. It's all coordinating. That's why we still don't understand the brain very well. We're just in the last 150 years going into brain science, and so it's a fairly new field, just like psychology is a fairly new field. So we don't really understand this stuff fully. We're just coming on to it. Anyways, I am exhausted. Thank you for this stream, everybody. I've really enjoyed talking with all of you, and you're all very important to me. I want you to know how grateful I am that I have the opportunity to speak on this platform with my partner Mercury Black, and it's just I'm getting a little emotional, but it feels like you guys are all family, even the ones of you that I don't know very well. It just feels like you're all you're a part of my life in a really important way, and I hope you continue to join us and ask amazing questions and provide insights. And I learned just as much from you all as I'm sure that you get out of this, or probably more. So, anyways, have a good day, and I should go. I'm getting pretty exhausted. Thanks very much.